Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for having us today. I'm Megan Sullivan. I'm the Acting Director for Indigenous Partnerships, External Relations, and Communications in the agency. So I'll start us off and then we'll have Nadine come in to speak more to our freshwater ecosystem initiatives. Okay, next slide, please. All right, I'll start by outlining what we'll cover in the next 12 minutes or so. So we're going to start off with just a bit of background on the agency, leading up to this point. Then we'll cover the current status. Then we'll get a bit more into our mandate, so strengthening federal coordination, and then how we're working to promote coordination externally with our partners and stakeholders. And then we'll cover some of our priority initiatives, including the Canada Water Act review, the development of the National Freshwater Data Strategy, and the freshwater ecosystem initiatives. Next slide, please. Okay, so going back to 2019, back in 2019, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada was directed through his mandate letter to create this new Canada Water Agency to work together with Indigenous communities, provinces, territories, and others to find the best ways to keep our water safe, clean, and well managed. So that was the direction from the Prime Minister. And then it was reiterated again numerous times through various speeches from the throne, federal budgets, and subsequent mandate letters. There were also some complementary commitments that were made, including implementing a strengthened freshwater action plan in key water bodies, and also following the creation of the Canada Water Agency, advancing the modernization of the Canada Water Act, which I'll get to a bit later. So for about 3 years, from 2020 to 2023, what was then called the Canada Water Agency Project Team, because we didn't exist yet, the team conducted quite extensive engagement throughout the country with a wide range of partners and stakeholders on the creation of the agency, what it should be, the structure, the mandate, etc. I know many of you were engaged, so thank you again. And this engagement strategy included the release of a discussion paper. There was public engagement with over 2,700 Canadians. Of course, engagement with our Indigenous partners, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. We received input from all provinces and territories. We held a national workshop and 6 regional workshops with panels of various water experts and Indigenous voices. So with that information, we were able to develop a proposal for the agency, which was ultimately approved by Cabinet. And then in budget 2023, the government dedicated some funding to the agency, 85.1 million over 5 years and 21 million yearly thereafter to support the creation of the agency, 650 million over 10 years to support monitoring, assessment, and restoration in our 8 priority water bodies, and then 22.6 million over 3 years to support better coordination to protect fresh water in Canada. Also in that same budget in 2023, the government committed to introducing legislation that year to fully establish the agency as a standalone entity, so outside of Environment and Climate Change Canada. But as an initial step, we launched within the department back in June 2023 as a branch. Next slide, please. Okay, so to fulfill that budget 2023 commitment to create the standalone agency, the government introduced legislation back in November of last year as part of Bill C-59. It was the Fall Economic Statement Implementation Act. And that legislation did pass and received royal assent in June 2024. So at this point, we are advancing various orders in council that will do various things, including setting the coming into force date of that legislation, as well as establishing Winnipeg as our headquarters, naming our interim president, etc. So as of now, this standalone agency is expected to launch in the coming weeks. We're targeting October 16th, and hopefully many of you can participate or join us via live stream, which we're working to set up right now. Next slide, please. All right, so moving on to the mandate of the agency. So really, above all, our goal is to provide federal leadership and improve coordination on freshwater. And that really begins with internal coordination within the federal government. So looking back over the years, federal action has been quite fragmented. We actually have a tally now of 26 different departments and agencies that have some freshwater related activities. It's been siloed. Departments are often working independently. They're not necessarily sharing information or aligning their funding, their engagement, et cetera. And it's been pretty opaque. Again, not very transparent. Data is often not well shared. And so this has led to gaps or overlap in work, unfocused investments, and it's also made it harder for our partners to track down information, federal information as well. So we're currently working to improve federal coordination in 3 main ways. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the first is we've established a permanent committee, a federal freshwater committee, involving all 26 of those departments and agencies with water activities. And the goal is really to create a forum for those more strategic discussions, for info exchange, and to build relationships across the departments. We're trying to establish a common federal voice on water and whole of government solutions that everyone can kind of contribute to. We also have established a federal freshwater hub. So this concept, it basically brings together 6 employees from across those 26 departments and agencies with water activities. And they come together for like 1 or 2 year assignments. And with them, they bring all their expertise from their home department, their networks, their connections. And it's really about improving the connective tissue across the government. And then finally, we have our Water One window. This is still in development, but it will ultimately be a centralized web presence where, well, it'll do 2 main things. One is it will provide links to federal freshwater information programs and services across those various departments. So it won't have the information, but it'll link to it almost like a portal. And then the second thing is there will be a point of contact for people outside the government to pose questions. And then on our side, we'll be the ones to actually track down the answers or track down the required expertise instead of making the public hunt them down themselves. Next slide, please. Okay, so in addition to improving coordination internally, we're also working to enhance coordination with external partners and agencies. So obviously, freshwater management is shared between federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, and in some cases, Indigenous governments. So it's really critical for us to work closely together while also respecting our unique jurisdiction. And so we work to promote external coordination and collaboration in several ways. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we hold regular meetings and information sessions with our partners and stakeholders to provide them with the latest updates, to talk about water issues, to learn from them what they're working on and explore collaboration opportunities. We also engage partners on key agency initiatives, providing capacity funding if needed. We also provide funding to some partners and stakeholders to pursue their own freshwater initiatives that align with our mandate. Just recently, we've started to pilot an Indigenous grassroots water circle to seek input from more grassroots level individuals, so like women, elders, youth, Two-Spirit, LGBT+. So this is an Indigenous centered safe space led by one of our Indigenous colleagues. Of course, with the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, we actively engage with our provincial territorial counterparts. We also chair the water management or co-chair the water management committee through the CCME. We participate in or chair various transboundary water boards, which Nadine can speak to a bit more. And then we're starting to do some early thinking into possible advisory mechanisms for the agency. So like a informal table of some kind. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of our priority initiatives at the moment, I'll just start with the Canada Water Act. So for everyone's awareness, the Act provides a framework for collaboration among the federal, provincial, and territorial governments on water-related matters. And back in 2021, the minister was mandated to advance the modernization of the Act. This is an act from 1970, by the way, so that it can better reflect today's freshwater realities, including climate change and Indigenous rights. So currently we have discussions underway with provinces, territories, and key Indigenous partners on how they want to engage in the process. So it's a sort of pre-engagement. And then in 2025, we hope to start the actual engagement on the substance of the Act and how we can improve it. And based on that, we'll explore ways to address the issues raised, whether through amendments to the Act or other policy means. And next slide, this is the final one from me. It's on the data strategy. So right now in Canada, I think many of you probably know there is actually a lot of water data that exists, but it's not always easily accessible or interoperable. So we are working on developing a national freshwater data strategy to make it easier for Canadians to find, access, use, and combine freshwater data to support decision making. So we're establishing common principles for freshwater data management with our partners and stakeholders, including Indigenous knowledge holders. And our first engagement phase is underway. We actually just had a workshop last week in Burlington with over 110 participants, very actively engaged. So I think it was a great start for this initiative. And the draft should be ready by spring, and hopefully the final strategy by next summer. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nadine to speak to our freshwater ecosystem initiatives on the next slide. Thanks.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, so I'll try and be brief and concise. The freshwater ecosystem initiatives are, in my opinion, the backbone of the Canada Water Agency. Budget 2023 invested $650 million in establishing the new Canada Water Agency, with a significant portion of this investment supporting the continued implementation of the pre-existing Freshwater Action Plan, including the Great Lakes, Lake Winnipeg Program, St. Lawrence Action Plan, and the Willistic St. John River. The investment includes the expansion of the Freshwater Action Plan to include the Fraser, Mackenzie Rivers, Lake of the Woods, and Lake Simcoe. This slide illustrates the extent of these freshwater ecosystem initiatives, and over time, as the agency evolves, there may be opportunity to expand further. While the aquatic ecosystem issues may vary from region to region, in general, the freshwater ecosystem initiatives will target excessive nutrient loading, sedimentation, toxic and nuisance algae, contaminated and degraded sites, and impacts from a changing climate. Next slide, please. The Canada Water Agency will deliver the strengthened Freshwater Action Plan through these freshwater ecosystem initiatives to respond to regional challenges and priorities, again, that vary across regions, but we'll access a variety of ecosystem-based management tools and approaches. And those include actions to restore and protect water quality and aquatic ecosystem health, advancements in science, including monitoring and supporting community-based monitoring, the use of Indigenous knowledge to support decision-making and effective actions, and enhancing governance to support improved collaboration with Indigenous partners, provinces and territories, and stakeholders. Knowledge mobilization and freshwater reporting are also key elements of our programming. And climate resilience through on-the-ground action is also an aspect. Not on the slide, but additionally, the agency will continue to lead and administer several intergovernmental transboundary water boards, notably 2 domestic water boards, the Prairie Provinces Water Board, established in 1969, and the Mackenzie River Basin Board, established in 1997. Boards such as these play an important role in transboundary freshwater management. And I'll leave it there just for time, but happy to answer questions later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both Megan and Nadine. So next up, I'd like to invite Ralph Penland from the Forum on Leadership in Water, whose wealth of policy experience precedes him.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you to all the participants online. I was asked to speak about the Canada Water Agency in the context of the evolution of past and probable future Canadian water governance. Since I first started working in this field, there have been 3 major inflection points, and we can likely expect a 4th one by mid-century. The Canada Water Agency is being established at the 3rd of those inflection points. When I first entered the field in 1961, most but not all Canadians had basic water and wastewater services. Water was considered to be relatively clean and superabundant, and the focus was almost exclusively on economic opportunities related to hydro, navigation, irrigation, and flood control. The first major inflection point occurred in the late 1960s, when we began to recognize limits and water pollution began to dominate the news. In 1969, first ministers met and agreed to create environmental agencies at the federal and provincial levels, and numerous environmental laws and programs were put in place. That inflection point also resulted in dozens of interjurisdictional water agreements in areas like river basin planning, flood damage reduction, water apportionment, and boundary water management. Modernized versions of several of those agreements are still in place. The second major inflection point took place in the mid to late 1980s. The financial and conceptual viability of many of our engineering-based approaches were being questioned, and several conflicts between economic and environmental matters ended up in the courts. We were on the losing end. At the same time, an international consensus was coalescing around the notion of sustainable development. The federal government responded with its 1987 federal water policy, and most provinces followed suit with conceptually very similar approaches. Arguably, water management since that time has become both less expensive and more sustainable through such policy shifts as encouraging new development in high flood risk areas, managing water demand through more realistic pricing, and managing chemicals through their full life cycle. The 2 major agreements negotiated during that era were multi-jurisdictional and implicated over half of the country. The Great Lakes St. Lawrence Diversions and Consumptive Use Agreement and Compact involved 8 states and 2 provinces. Mackenzie Comprehensive Transboundary Agreements involved 3 provinces and 3 territories. Interestingly, even though they are quite different in substance, both of these agreements, or agreement negotiations, had as their primary objective sustaining ecological integrity. It's also interesting that although the federal government was helpful in these negotiations, they were minor players in the actual discussions. The third major inflection point is occurring right now. It's being driven by 2 key factors. First, it's become clear that climate change is having, and will continue to have, much more significant economic, ecological, and social impacts than previously anticipated. And at the same time, society is becoming much more responsive to Indigenous and other societal rights, social rights. Once again, there are good signs that both the federal and provincial governments are beginning to react appropriately. If you look at the results of the extensive federal public consultations leading up to the agency and compare them with recent provincial ministerial mandate letters, you'll see a great deal of congruence. And you'll also see in both a recognition of the need for broad collaboration. The agency is only in its formative stage, and it's much too early to pass judgment on its probable effectiveness. But the mandate does seem to strike an appropriate balance between supporting decision makers at all levels and fully respecting all legal and constitutional mandates, while at the same time dealing with fragmentation, gaps, and overlaps within the federal bureaucracy. There is a saying that all politics is local. It's also true that the effectiveness of government agencies are often judged by local accomplishments. For that reason, the agency is likely to be judged in the short run mainly by expenditures and direct results under its action plan in major interjurisdictional basins. That's all very good and necessary, but it's not sufficient. In the long run, lasting effectiveness of the agency will depend on national water governance for the better, in ways similar to what happened after the first two inflection points. The potential is there. Success will depend to a great extent on internal leadership and sustained political support. I'd just like to mention 5 illustrative examples with potential for positive societal change through improved collaboration within the federal system and across the Canadian water sector. First, meaningful integration of traditional knowledge and contemporary Indigenous governance structures in freshwater management. Second, a more comprehensive national flood damage reduction program, including intergovernmental agreements and integrated public-private flood insurance system. Third, agricultural, industrial, municipal technology development and transfer in support of climate change resilience. Fourth, improved support for regional centers of scientific excellence, possibly including a freshwater subvention program for universities. And fifth, federal and provincial cooperation in creating winning conditions for small and medium-sized watershed organizations in the context of a broader nested watershed approach. I'd like to finish up by going out on a limb a bit and looking ahead to the next inflection point, maybe around 2050 or thereabouts. As the hydrologic cycle continues to change, along with an evolving economy and somewhat uncertain demographics and geopolitics, it's highly likely that we'll be facing substantial new challenges that we can't even contemplate today. How should we prepare for the unknown? I'd like to suggest 3 things. First, about 35 years ago, I co-chaired something called the Resource Use and Management Subcommittee of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. At that time, the timing and magnitude of climate change was highly uncertain. What we recommended at the time was basically a no regrets approach, meaning we should avoid overreacting, but we should do everything we should be doing anyway, and we should be doing those things faster and better. I would suggest the same today. The second thing we must do is continue to support both applied research and a lot of basic or curiosity research. For example, hypothetically, we might very well face a time when chemicals in the environment are fundamentally threatening the health of whole societies. We obviously can't just eliminate all non-essential chemical products tomorrow, but we should at least have the basic research available to do so if needed at some point in the future. Third, looking back over the past century, despite temporary setbacks from time to time, the arc of history has always been bending in the direction of justice, beginning with the supply of basic services, then adding an environmental component, and finally adding a social justice component. We'll hopefully keep that arc of justice heading in a positive direction, but we can only do that if governments increasingly understand and accept that they have a fiduciary duty to preserve the essence of renewable resources for the use and enjoyment of all, now and into the future. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing Oliver and any questions that might come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph. It was a privilege to hear your perspective for what is ahead, including the winning conditions for watershed organizations, and I know it's near and dear. It's a pleasure, last but not least, to welcome Oliver Brandes, who leads the University of Victoria's award-winning POLIS Water Sustainability Project, to take the floor. I see the slides already up, which is perfect, and I'll put that by in the chat.
Good day, everybody. I am coming to you from the mouth of the Colquitts on Lekwungen and the Esquimalt peoples, and I'm grateful, also known as Victoria, the far west coast. So I have the very fortunate opportunity to kind of say, buckle up. We learned a bit of where we are, Ralph helped us to understand where we need to go, and I intend to shoot us up into the stratosphere. And you can see by the title, this is about the bigger world of governance and some of the future pieces and how the feds or the federal government might fit into that. And I'd like to start with this simple picture, and I'm not telling you this because you don't know this. You are all living it. But fundamentally, the larger public and certainly our senior institutions do not fully understand this. And I think of these four kind of components. We often at POLIS call it the four horsemen of the water apocalypse: drought, fire, flood, unsafe water. They often happen in that sequence. And the fundamental problem is that our institutions, the wider public, are captured by a notion that these are short-term, temporary, surprise events. We ride them out. And as long as we think that, we won't win. We will fail. We have to understand that fundamentally water ties to the many issues of the day. I think most of us understand that. But there's a couple really important pieces here. And that idea of security and health, certainly justice around reconciliation, quality of life, and thinking about health and water and watersheds as an extension of the health system becomes a fundamental piece. And that pivots us right into this notion of watershed security. So this is a wonderful set of terms, but what do we mean by it? And it's, of course, the sort of interconnected nature of a number of these very important pieces: forests, water, salmon, food, jobs, community health, prosperity. But there's an institutional dimension. So there's a management component, water quality and quantity. There's a integrated and nested approach, and don't worry, we'll explore that a little bit, but that's where we start talking about whole of watershed and resilience. And this governance, decisions and governance really become central, and that's what shifts our mindset. When we talk about governance, we know that widely held, the public understands, they intuitively understand that protecting water has something to do with expertise, science, and traditional knowledge. We know that there's rules and enforcement. We know that citizens and local control, including planning, are critical. What the exact proportions of this elixir or this cocktail is the big challenge. So these are kind of the bigger picture. And as we talk about governance, anybody in Canada will spend some time pondering these questions. Well, who does decide? And we know that at a minimum, it's at least these four levels of authority. We know that province and federal government, which is sort of a comfortable regime, we see a changing and emerging role for local government, especially around source protection and hydrology in the local sense. And of course, the role of Indigenous governments fundamentally shift. And as we begin to think about this mix, we'll focus a little bit on the specifics. And don't worry, this isn't a detailed lecture on the division of powers. You can come to the law school and learn a bit about that. But it is to recognize that the way we've organized our Constitution is important, and how we organize ourselves is important. And we know that one sort of anomaly is that water isn't mentioned in the Constitution, but we know that there's a number of these defined powers and authorities. And of course, the province carry the bulk of it. And we're seeing this changing role for the Indigenous inherent authority and how that manifests. And certainly where I live in BC, we see that in a very acute way. But to make it simple for the federal government, we can think about it in terms of things that touch water rather than water itself. Fish, boats, meaning navigation, big infrastructure, borders, reserves, federal lands. That is one way to think about it. And it becomes important when we start thinking about this bigger governance story in this broad sense, because then the federal government needs to play a critical role. And when we talk about this complex world that we need to get to, there's going to be many hands on the oars. And if any one oar does not do its part, we risk toppling the whole boat. And of course, in Canada, and I know Ralph has lived this in quite a bit of detail, we sometimes struggle with the federal role. And we often have provinces with fever dreams of federal overreach. And so this is going to be an important piece of what we're going to have to navigate, this idea of grasping intrusions and shifting our mindset. And we see it many places around the world where we can begin to understand how these different levels and different institutions can work together collaboratively rather than in an opposing or in a siloed way. So this is the part where I get to go and think about the bigger future story, right? It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. This is an important piece to think about. So we're talking about speculation, but we do know a few things, and we can talk about some of the really critical drivers of change. And this really is a slide I'd like to spend a lot of time on, but for today's purposes, I just want to introduce some of these ideas. I think most of these are familiar to the audience. And so these are the components that any governance arrangement and the federal role in it, including the water laws, will have to address. And so I won't go through them in detail, and I just share them because you'll get a chance probably to see these slides. But there's a couple really important conclusion and future realities that, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but climate will never be better than now. It only gets worse. Water in all its forms will be more varied and insecure, wildfire more intense. Adaptation, natural defenses, and captured carbon and water, of course, will become highly valuable. That means functioning watersheds. You can't imagine a world that we get there where everybody isn't doing their part. So this future focus on security, resilience, and climate adaptation becomes critical. And of course, I don't want to just conjure up hope that this can just happen, but the institutional ways we do it, the way the programs roll out, become really critical. And this fundamental notion of watershed governance, which is an open-ended concept, but remember, it's both bottom up and top down. It is not a binary. It is not somebody else does it all, or we all have to do it ourselves here. It's place-based, and this ecological component is important, but it's locally adapted. It's based on co-governance, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And this local capacity and expertise and capability becomes central. To achieve this bigger vision, this kind of an integrated program has a number of pieces, and we could talk extensively about all the pieces, but I'll just spend a few minutes talking about how the Canada Water Act can be a part of this. So we know there's kind of 4 core elements if we're going to do it right. This is my view, but shared by many of Flo, and I think we've put this together in some of our past work. Co-drafting with Indigenous people is how you manifest reconciliation in a practical way. We need to enable integrated river basin planning and management. That's where the collaboration comes. Collaboration is not just folks sitting in a boardroom deciding together what they might do next. It's actually making choices and having consequences. It means that the federal role in transboundary water management needs to be bolstered. There's more that can be done. And we need to provide authority and mandate to these new federal water institutions, some of which don't even exist yet. Just like Ralph said, we're not just talking about the next decision or the decision on that, but what about the 99 decisions that we're going to still have to make, many of which we don't even know what the context is for? That's governance at its heart. I just remind us of some sense of how old the act is. This is a picture of young Trudeau. That was when the act was just being introduced. Paul is quitting the Beatles. Most of you don't even remember. That was a home computer. Simon and Garfunkel were tops in the charts. And this is what cell phones look like. So you can imagine if all these pieces seem as ridiculous today, one can imagine an outdated act is equally ridiculous, and we need to start addressing it. And I'm just going to touch on 2 components that I'd like to see us really take seriously. There's, of course, many, and we could have an extensive conversation around that. But the first is this idea of a nested system. One can think of the classic Russian doll with nested. If we understand that that's a key component of thinking like a watershed, and that is how we make federation work for water, is by thinking of this nested system and where the senior governments enable and create spaces for collaboration across the scale. And it starts with the local. That local decision-making becomes fundamental. So it really shifts the notion of senior government from a top-down manager to the enabler of local decisions. And of course, in Canada, we can't even begin to talk about that when we don't acknowledge cooperation and overlapping jurisdiction between Indigenous legal orders and Crown laws and authority. And you can imagine this is a whole field that we could spend a dozen webinars discussing, but let's just think of it in simple terms as Indigenous legal orders being very place-based and how it overlaps with Crown laws and authority, which is of general application. And there's a number of tools and mechanisms and approaches institutionally of how we do this, how an institution collaborates in a meaningful way. and these are listed here. The fundamental piece, of course, is the notion of free, prior, and informed consent. I'm going to just skip over this and not go into too much detail, except for to remind us that this is fundamentally about collaboration where we're sharing. It does not mean that all parties are involved in all decisions, but they decide where collaboration is necessary. We use the analogy of bending the beams. Both Indigenous and Crown governments adapt institutions, their decision structures and timelines, creating shared spaces. That's how it happens. And to take the law question one step further, when we talk about water law, we often think in terms of just enough water for the fish to survive. We're not talking about thriving, and we're talking about the bare necessity on drinking water. That's the very limited scope of how we think about water law. We need to widen our thinking. We need to be thinking about those key linkages. And one of my pet projects, and certainly flow, name not coincidental here, between environmental flows, watershed health, and Indigenous rights. That's one of those powerful pieces where the federal government to date hasn't been playing as fulsome a role. And because of the complexity, when we talk about the life pulse of a river or a stream or a lake, we need to be thinking about these broader environmental flow components. And that requires, again, that multi-jurisdictional approach and that very deep collaboration. And in my last few seconds, I'm just going to outline a few of the components that I think a meaningful Water Act will contain, right? River basin level agreements and plans to implement. There's got to be rules, there's got to be trade-offs, there's got to be consequences. Who does it? The locals. How do we do it? We enable. Power to productively enforce these basin level standards. They don't get to choose everything. There are certain fundamental ecological realities we have to live by. Environmental flows, quality, quantity, there's a number of pieces. We need to get past just emergency powers and this broader sense of responsibility to the broader system. These co-governance agreements are the fundamental pillar. And there's a number of innovations. I know Ralph has a few favorites here. So do I. Public trust doctrine, e-flow protection, enabling better water land planning and watershed governance. You start in transboundary, but the federal role can exist in other places as well for a variety of reasons. And this is my favorite slide to end on, and I recognize I'm 53 seconds over. So I'll just leave it here saying that there's a number of these big ideas in the water world. We need to be ready. This is about the next inflection point, as Ralph has said. We don't need an act that worked circa 1970. We need an act that works in the context of these pieces, because these are where the solutions are. And for me, watershed governance, shared decision-making at the watershed scale is the most fundamental. A question of not when, sorry, not if, but when. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So before we open it up to questions, and please do pose your questions in the Q&A and mention specifically which speaker you would like to have respond. I'd like to invite the panelists to have a bit of a moderator discussion, an impromptu version where we have Oliver posing a question to Megan and Nadine.
Sure, I'll appreciate that. I think Ralph alluded to it. I think the idea that we can walk and chew gum, meaning we can think about the big picture, the stuff I hurled us into the stratosphere around. I think that's very important. That's where the agency is going to have to go. But you also have to be meaningful and have impact locally. So do you have a sense of some of the most important projects where you can make lives for watersheds, communities, Canadians better starting now? I'd love to know.
I think I'll try. Megan, if you want to add.
Sure.
If you think of the Canada Water Agency, it's forming in two significant pathways. One is that national level strategy development, enhanced coordination across federal departments, and then the freshwater ecosystem initiatives. And so the Great Lakes program, the Lake Winnipeg program, have a long history. They've been around for 20 plus years. And this latest investment will advance on the ground action in completing work around, say, areas of concerns in the Great Lakes. So I think we're moving in the right direction. We've got strategies that are developing on a more national scale and a real focus on regional on-the-ground action to improve aquatic ecosystem health now. And the combined effort of those two, I think, will bring us to a better place.
Megan?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think probably on Nadine's side with the freshwater ecosystem initiatives, that's probably how Canadians will see the most tangible impacts in the near to medium future. But on our side of the agency, working to improve coordination and making it easier for Canadians to access, find information, data, expertise on freshwater. I hope that'll have an impact for many of you. And then in the longer term, obviously there's the policies and the lawmaking where we'll play a integral role. But obviously, as you know, it's going to take several years of engagement, and that's a longer term initiative. But yeah, I think we'll have, hopefully we'll impact Canadians in across these many dimensions.
Thank you. So there's a lot of interest in how to collaborate, not just across jurisdictions, but across scales, and with a lot of interest in going back to watersheds and sub-watersheds and recognizing the decades of work there. Ralph, I'd like to invite you to also pose a question to Megan and Nadine.
Okay, first I'd just like to congratulate all three speakers that are very informative and evocative. Enjoyed them a lot. So I have a question. When I look at the specific initiatives, projects under the action plan, what I see is a lot of very useful local products that will be very helpful in that local watershed. But it seems to me there's also potential to take a lot of those, especially in the Great Lakes, and turn them into, I guess you call them technology development and transfer, which could be useful right across the country. So wondering how you're going to take advantage of that potential to transfer some of those technologies across the country.
I think it's fair to say that the freshwater ecosystem or the freshwater action plan functioned historically sort of in regional silos. So the consolidation and bringing together the programs in a more cohesive way within a Canada Water Agency will facilitate that cross-pollination, the sharing of exchange and sharing of knowledge across programming. And of course, we aim to develop consistency in, on a national scale, but in a regional context. So we'll have communities of practice that work with results from, say, one program that are potentially applicable in another area. It is in our intention to support technological innovation to pilot it and test it. And if we get good results in one program, of course, we're going to work horizontally across all the programs to promote and advocate for that. I think that addresses your question.
Yes, thank you.
And also, thank you for taking a Socratic approach. The more one knows what one doesn't know. And so appreciate you playing along. I've definitely learned quite a lot already. And I'd like to invite Megan and Nadine from the CWA perspective to pose a question to the audience here, something for us to take home and to ponder. And if folks have ideas that they want to pop into the chat, they can also do so.
Maybe from my side, one thing to consider is, how we can best engage you. Given our mandate for coordination and collaboration, we want to hear from experts across all sectors and from all backgrounds. And I've presented today some ideas we have, and some are still in the works. I mentioned a kind of an informal advisory committee that we're starting to contemplate. But any advice people have for how we can better reach you, better support you, to ensure that you can meaningfully engage in the agency. Yeah, we welcome your thoughts.
That's great.
I'll ask one too, if that's all right, just for reflection. I'm the chair of the Prairie Provinces Water Board and the Mackenzie River Basin Board. The PPWB, I refer to it as a peacekeeping agreement. It really does commit the governments to share what could be very limited resources in the future in an equitable way. And with MRBB, it had the foresight to have Indigenous membership stand equal with government representatives. So I've got a lot of insight, but I'm really curious to hear maybe through the organization what your thoughts are on some of the best examples of good governance structures that bring together all partners and stakeholders, like examples that are really effective. I would appreciate getting some feedback in that area.
Thank you. And so now we're going to open it up to the Q&A from the audience based off of what we see in the chat and what folks have been upvoting. There's quite a lot of interest in the question from Kate, who says, please don't forget to leverage local knowledge holders to support work by STB, including but not limited to Ontario's conservation authorities.
Conservation authorities and their conservation districts in Manitoba, they're key partners to our programs. We do a significant amount of work with, in my context, Lake Winnipeg, I'm speaking from Treaty 1 territory. We do extensive work with conservation districts, which are your equivalents. And we always try to take an extensive and inclusive approach. You know, if people have knowledge to add and have perspective, we will always take those into account. We're not limiting ourselves to, well, this is what our scientists say. We work with academic institutions. We really do want to take a comprehensive and cohesive approach.
Thank you. And I see a question in French by Sylvain. Rebecca, would you like to read that?
So we have a question in French from Mr. Lapointe. What is the vision from the agency in order to deal with the organizations, watershed organizations in Quebec?
There was an issue with the sound at this point. Nadine was speaking in French and the interpreter was interpreting to English. This is what the interpreter said. There is the St. Lawrence Action Plan. It is an agreement that governs the relationship between the federal government and Quebec. It's a relationship that's well established, and we will continue to work with this relationship because it's very efficient.
Thank you. So there's a question that was also upvoted by Chris. How will the Water One window also help to consolidate existing federal freshwater data sources? And if this ends up being the last question, please don't fret because the speakers will receive these and we will also send that back to all of you.
I can speak to that. So as I mentioned, the Water One window won't itself hold the data. It'll be more of a portal linking to data across the federal government. That being said, we're also working on this national freshwater data strategy. And thus far, we've been funded to develop the strategy. But in the future, pending further funding, we are also looking at maybe developing a sort of data catalog. So the two initiatives to follow there.
If I could just add, we're in early days. So I think that the potential for the Canada Water Agency is enormous. Coming from an internal perspective, we had a very intense 3-year period of engaging. We had over 2,000 sort of documented engagements in various ways. We really tried to engage and consult in a very broad way in planning and preparing what would become the Canada Water Agency. And internally, we still are, very preoccupied with sort of administrative, legislative types of activities to actually stand up the agency, which will happen mid-October, just around the corner. But we have to still go through a period of growth. We have to staff up still. We have to establish new positions. And it's amazing. It's from an internal perspective, it's amazing what a relatively small group of public servants have established and created. And I am very optimistic about the future potential of the agency. We're just starting, to plant the seeds. So when you're asking questions about data strategy, still early days in forming. So it's not that we're not trying to provide direct answers. I think we're still in a period in many elements of developing, potential options for what would and should look like, for example, a national data strategy as just one example.
So I'd like to thank Nadine, Megan, Ralph, and Oliver for not just sharing your time with us today, but for also doing this work, for building that collaborative approach to getting all our waters in good health across the nation, for your wealth of experience that you're sharing with us today. We are at time, but I would like to just do one quick poll. Our speakers have also very generously offered to respond to the questions afterwards. And as you've just heard now from Nadine, this is very much a work in development, so please continue to engage. There's a great deal of openness and willingness on the part of the CWR, so we're very thankful for you joining us in this webinar. So the first question in the closing poll copy today is, based on today's session, is your understanding the Canada Water Agency newly informed, refined, sparked? You want to lean in and learn even more. So it looks like quite a few folks are filling in a bit more gaps, but there was a good sense of the direction. That's great. Would you like to know about further engagement opportunities with the Canada Water Agency? A resounding yes. That's great to see. And then what is your preferred way to engage with the Canada Water Agency? We're seeing a lot of folks that would like more online webinars, in-person roundtables, so that speaks to that local and watershed-based approach there, workshops in person or online, as well as email updates, of course. And there's other. So if folks put other, please definitely reach out so we can share that back in terms of capturing your preferences.
Thank you so much for hosting. I really appreciate your efforts.
It's yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. OLW will continue to offer spaces like this for the Freshwater Community Connect, and maybe for longer durations of time so there's more interaction as well. So thank you all very, very much.